There is a painting that spent 25 years lying in the dark inside a storage room at Windsor Castle, and last week 2 members of that family walked it back out into the light. Princess Anne helped William pull off something that had been building for a quarter of a century, and the fallout inside those walls was so immediate and so violent that Camilla was left standing there completely gobsmacked, running straight to Charles and demanding that he fix it, only to discover she had absolutely no power to stop any of it. But the portrait is not actually the part that broke her. William built the plan. Every legal step, every institutional box ticked, all of it designed so that nobody could ever undo it. And then Anne did one thing at the end that was not in that plan at all, that nobody had scheduled and nobody had prepared for, and that landed on Camilla harder than the painting ever could. It stunned the country when it got out. From what I understand, it stunned William too. We are going to get to that, so stay with me. Before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss where this ends up. Quick word before we go deeper. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family. The records, the inquiry documents, the reporting that got buried before anybody finished asking questions. And what you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them, not a palace press release. Stay to the end, because the last 30 seconds of this story are 5 words long, and they were spoken in a room with 2 women in it. So let me tell you exactly what happened. William pulled Princess Diana's official portrait out of the storage room, where it had been sitting for over 2 decades, and placed it exactly where it was always supposed to go, on the Hall of Matriarchs wall at Windsor, directly beside Queen Elizabeth. If you have not heard that name before, the Hall of Matriarchs is the wall inside Windsor reserved for the women who actually shaped this monarchy. It is the most sacred ceremonial space in the entire residence. Camilla had no idea it was coming. She saw it, and by every account she was completely gobsmacked. She ran straight to Charles and ordered him to have it taken down immediately. And what Charles did next turned that entire palace upside down, and I will get to that too, because his reaction is the second most devastating thing in this story. But first you need to understand the wound underneath all of it, because none of what happened makes any sense without it. There is a portrait of Princess Diana that most people have never seen up close, and the story of where that painting has been sitting for the last 25 years is going to make your stomach drop. It was painted during one of the most celebrated periods of her entire public life. She was at the height of absolutely everything. Her beauty, her warmth, that thing she did that no royal before her had ever managed, where she made ordinary people feel seen and loved by somebody who had no reason at all to notice them. People who were in the room when Diana first saw the finished portrait say she stood in front of it for a long time and did not say anything. Think about that for a second, because that is a very specific kind of silence. That is what happens to a person when something captures exactly who they are, and they were not expecting it to. That portrait was supposed to hang in the Hall of Matriarchs. Diana never saw it hang there. She died before it happened. And after she died, the portrait was quietly removed from consideration, wrapped up, and put into palace storage, where it sat in the dark for over 20 years while the world outside those walls kept putting her face on magazine covers and memorial stamps and the front of every book about the modern monarchy. Now here is where you have to slow down, because what was happening inside that building in the days after her death is a completely different story to the one the country was watching on television. Diana died on the 31st of August, 1997, and the world grieved openly and loudly. You remember the flowers outside the gates. You remember the crowd standing there in the rain because they did not know where else to go. On the other side of those gates, it was quieter. And honestly, it was a great deal uglier. Within hours of her death being confirmed, the first calls made from inside the palace were not calls of grief. Royal insiders have reported for years that among the very first concerns raised in those hours was whether Diana had any crown jewelry in her possession in Paris. Somebody wanted to know where the property was. The scramble to reclaim it started before the British public had even been told their princess was gone. And while that was going on, Camilla was already moving. Camilla had spent years as the hidden woman. The one Charles visited in secret while he was married to somebody else. The one Diana called the Rottweiler in private, because Diana understood better than anybody alive exactly what this woman was doing to her marriage and exactly how good she was at doing it. Now Diana was gone, and Camilla started moving through the palace rooms Diana had called home. And she did not simply move in. Stop and think about the difference here, because it matters. Moving in is what anybody does. Camilla erased. Diana had kept fresh flowers throughout the spaces she lived in, arrangements she had chosen herself because that was the kind of small, personal thing she cared about. Camilla ordered them removed and burned, not replaced. Burned. There is a difference between throwing something out and setting fire to it, and everybody who worked in that house understood which one they were being asked to do. Then the bedroom. The room Diana had slept in. The room where she had held her boys, the room where she had cried alone at night and written in private when there was nobody left to talk to. Camilla ordered that room locked permanently, and I keep coming back to this detail because of what it says about her. She did not want to sleep in there herself. She had no use for the room at all. She simply made absolutely certain that nobody else would ever sleep in it either. She wanted it sealed off like something shameful, like a stain you cover with furniture rather than clean. Diana's personal items were boxed up and relocated. Her image started disappearing from the most prominent ceremonial spaces inside the royal residences, and it did not happen all at once, which is the part that makes it work. Nobody ever stood up and announced that the pictures were coming down. One frame moved to a smaller room, then another one moved to a corridor. Then a third simply stopped being anywhere at all, and by the time anybody noticed the pattern, there was nothing left to point at. That is how you erase a person from a building without ever writing an instruction down. You do it in pieces small enough that objecting to any single one of them makes you look unreasonable. And the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor, that wall of honor reserved for the women who built this thing, never received her portrait at all. For over 20 years, the most beloved royal woman of the modern era was missing from her own family's wall because one woman found her presence uncomfortable. Foreign heads of state walked past that wall. Prime ministers walked past it. Her own sons walked past it at every family occasion of their adult lives and counted the faces and knew exactly whose was not there. Now let me take you to the boy in all of this, because everything that happened last week runs directly through him. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London on the 6th of September, 1997. He walked in silence, in a dark suit, in front of the entire planet, with his face completely still. And people forget that he was not walking behind that coffin as an innocent child who did not understand what had happened to his parents. He was a child who already knew that his father had been having an affair with another woman for years because Diana had sat him down and told him herself. She told him there were 3 people in that marriage. She said that was the reason the family had come apart. If that phrase sounds familiar to you, it is because she said a version of it out loud on national television in the Panorama interview in November of 1995, and the whole country heard it at the same time her sons did. His younger brother found out in a completely different way, and honestly, this is one of the saddest details in the entire story. Harry was sitting, watching a television debate about the monarchy with his mother. Camilla's name appeared on the screen, and he turned to Diana and asked her who that was. And Diana had to explain it to her youngest son right there, live in the middle of a program, with absolutely no preparation and no gentle way to do it. But the most devastating thing William would ever learn about what was done to his mother did not come from a conversation at all. It came from a letter. In October of 1995, 2 years before she died, Diana wrote a note to her solicitor, Lord Mishcon. And in that note she stated that she believed her husband was planning to have her killed in a staged car accident. She wrote about brake failure and serious head injury. She wrote that it would leave him free to move on. She wrote that Camilla was nothing but a decoy, and that she herself was being used by the man in every sense of the word. 2 years after she wrote those words, Diana died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris. That note was handed to police after her death, and then sat untouched for 6 years before it finally reached Scotland Yard. 6 years. Think about that for a second, because it is the detail in this whole story that I cannot get past. A woman writes down that she believes her husband is planning to kill her in a car. She gives it to her lawyer. She dies in a car 2 years later. The lawyer hands the note to the police, and then it sits in a drawer for 6 years while the country holds inquests and prints theories and argues about seatbelts. Nobody has ever given a satisfying account of those 6 years. Charles was eventually questioned about it privately at St. James's Palace as part of the inquiry that followed. Now, I want to be straight with you here because this is the part where a lot of channels start selling you something. That inquiry looked at the note and looked at the crash and concluded there was no evidence of any conspiracy at all. I am not standing here telling you Diana was right about what she wrote. I am telling you that she wrote it. I am telling you she was frightened enough of the man she had married to put it in writing and hand it to a lawyer. And I am telling you that her 15-year-old son eventually grew up and read it. Watch what he does with the rest of his life, because that letter is sitting underneath every single decision. William and Harry did not know the full contents of that note for years, and when William finally understood what his mother had been writing down in the last 2 years of her life, and then turned around and looked at what had been done to her memory inside the palace walls after her death, something inside him hardened completely. It has never softened since, not once. He watched Camilla move through the rooms his mother had lived in. He watched portraits of his mother come off the walls. He watched the Hall of Matriarchs stand there with a gap in it where Diana should have been, year after year, at every state occasion, at every family gathering, at every point in his life when he walked past that wall and counted the faces. And in public he kept his face completely still, the way he had learned to at 15. On the inside, the anger was eating him alive. At 16, he finally broke. He pulled aside somebody close to him, and he let all of it out at once. He said Camilla got her claws into his father and never let go for a single instant. He said that was the reason his mother was dead, because Diana had been driven out of her own family, stripped of her protection, pushed further and further out until there was nobody left standing around her, and she ended up alone and unprotected in a Paris tunnel in the middle of the night. A 16-year-old boy said those words about the woman who was by then living in his mother's home. And then he carried every single one of them, quietly, without repeating them to anybody who mattered, for the next 25 years. And that is the part people underestimate about William. And I think they underestimate it because he is so good at being pleasant in a receiving line. He was 16 when he worked out exactly what he thought had happened to his mother, and he has not changed his mind about a word of it since. He simply understood something at 16 that most people never understand at all, which is that saying a true thing at the wrong moment gets you nothing except the satisfaction of having said it. So he shook her hand at Christmas. He stood next to her in photographs. He supported her elevation when the moment came, in public, on camera, with a straight face. And he waited until the day he had the authority to act, and he never once let her see it coming. But William was not the only person in that family walking around with a wound connected to Camilla. There was one other, and hers ran deeper than his, and hers started long before Diana ever entered the picture. That person is Princess Anne. Before Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, Andrew Parker Bowles was in a serious romantic relationship with Anne. Not a passing thing, not a rumor somebody invented afterwards. They were close enough that marriage was being discussed between them, and the royal family shut it down. Andrew was Catholic. Anne, as a senior member of the Church of England, was not permitted to marry him, so she stepped aside. because that is what she has done her entire life every time the institution has asked her to, and because she genuinely had no choice in the matter at all. Within a very short time, Camilla moved in, and Andrew proposed to her, and Anne sat in the pews at their wedding in 1973 and watched it happen. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is the foundation of everything that came after it. A young woman in her early 20s sitting in a church watching the man she had been talking about marrying marry somebody else, having been told she was not allowed to be the one standing up there. And doing it in public, in a hat with photographers outside, with her face arranged into exactly the expression the institution required of her that afternoon. She did not make a scene. She has never made a scene about anything in her life. She sat through the service, she went to the reception, and she has never in 50 years said one public word about what that day cost her. That is the woman we are talking about here. Not somebody who lashes out. Somebody who files things away. And then the woman who took him spent the next several decades as a secret mistress who destroyed Anne's brother's marriage, broke Diana into pieces in front of the entire world, and eventually walked into Buckingham Palace with a crown on her head. Royal biographers have written for years that Camilla was deeply intimidated by Anne, that Anne's coldness toward her was nerve-wracking to be around, and that whatever sat between those two women from 1973 was never resolved, and was never going to be. And I think it is worth being precise about what that means in practice, because it is not shouting and it is not a feud anybody could photograph. It is a woman who says good morning and then says nothing else for the rest of the day. It is being seated correctly at every dinner for 50 years and never once being spoken to like family at any of them. It is the specific coldness of somebody who is never rude enough to give you anything you could complain about. After the coronation in May of 2023, Anne reportedly confronted Camilla at a private luncheon, looked her directly in the eye and told her something that has been repeated around that household ever since. That she is not the queen, that she is the king's wife. Anne has allegedly never bowed to her, not once. The story goes that she asked Queen Elizabeth personally for permission to be exempt from that particular protocol, and that the Queen granted it without much of an argument. And through all of it, Anne watched Diana be erased. She watched the portrait disappear into storage. She watched that wall stay empty for 20 years while the family put out statements about legacy and memory. And she carried every single piece of it in the way that Anne carries things, which is silently and permanently and without ever giving anybody the satisfaction of seeing it. So you had two people inside that family who both wanted the exact same thing, for completely different reasons, and who had both been waiting a very long time to get it. They wanted Diana back on that wall. And then came the night when the waiting was finally over. Now, William had spent years preparing this, and the preparation is the part that tells you what kind of man is going to be running this country. He did not storm into a gallery with a painting under his arm. He took meetings with curators about portrait placement protocol. He went through the historical records on every previous placement on that wall going back decades, so he could point at precedent for every single step. He made absolutely certain that every institutional rule was followed to the letter, so that once the portrait was hanging, there was no legal route for anybody on earth to challenge it or reverse it. He had been playing a 20-year chess game inside his own family. This was the move he had been building toward the entire time. And in the last video on this channel, I covered what Anne did in that corridor outside the throne room, the day she crushed Camilla's final plea and walked Catherine straight through those doors while the whole country looked at the photograph over breakfast the next morning. A lot of you came into the comments underneath it asking me the same thing. You wanted to know what Anne and William are actually capable of when the two of them stop working separately and start working together. This is that video. Because the night before it happened, William picked up the phone and called his aunt. The call was short.
Buckingham Palace has spent nearly 3 decades managing one unresolved problem: what to do with the memory of a woman it never quite knew how to handle while she was alive and has struggled with just as much since her death. That woman is Diana, Princess of Wales. And the two people most entangled in that unfinished business are her eldest son, Prince William, and the woman his father eventually married, Camilla, now Queen. This is not a story about a secret confrontation in a locked gallery, because no such scene has ever been documented by any credible source. It is something more useful than that. It is the real, sourced history of how a family tried to move forward from tragedy, while one figure from the past refused to disappear from public consciousness, no matter how carefully anyone tried to manage it. Let's start with what actually happened in the days and years after Diana's death, because the documented record alone is extraordinary enough without embellishment. Diana died in the early hours of the 31st of August, 1997, in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. Her sons were staying with their father at Balmoral in Scotland when the news broke. 15-year-old William walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London on the 6th of September, 1997, alongside his father, his younger brother, his grandfather Prince Philip, and Diana's brother, Earl Spencer. That image of two boys walking in silence behind a flag-draped coffin while a nation wept has never left Britain's collective memory. Robert Lacey, the royal historian who served as a historical consultant on Netflix's The Crown, and the author of Battle of Brothers, published in 2020, has written extensively about the psychological toll that walk took on both boys, describing it as a formative trauma that shaped the rest of their lives in strikingly different directions. What often gets left out of the popular retelling is what Diana herself had already told her sons and told the world before she died. In November 1995, Diana gave the now famous Panorama interview to journalist Martin Bashir. In it, she delivered the line that has since become inseparable from the story of her marriage. "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." She was referring unambiguously to Camilla Parker Bowles, whose relationship with Prince Charles had continued, on and off, for years, both before and during his marriage to Diana. That interview aired on national television and was watched by an estimated 23 million people in Britain alone. Both William and Harry, teenagers at the time, absorbed its contents along with everyone else. Diana's biographer Andrew Morton, whose 1992 book Diana, her true story, was later revealed to have been based on secret tape recordings made with Diana's full cooperation, had already documented the depth of her distress over the affair years before the Panorama broadcast made it public knowledge. There is also a genuinely documented piece of this story that sounds almost too dramatic to be real, and yet it is a matter of public record, examined by official investigators rather than tabloid speculation. In October 1995, Diana wrote a note to her solicitor, Lord Mishcon of the firm Mishcon de Rea, expressing fears for her safety, including a concern that she might be harmed in a staged car accident. This document, often referred to as the Mishcon Note, became part of the evidence considered years later by Operation Paget, the Metropolitan Police investigation into Diana's death, and by the formal inquest overseen by Lord Justice Scott Baker, which concluded in April 2008 after 6 months of hearings. The inquest jury ultimately ruled that Diana and her companion Dodi Fayed were unlawfully killed as a result of the grossly negligent driving of their chauffeur Henri Paul and the pursuing paparazzi vehicles, and it found no evidence to support conspiracy theories involving the royal family. It's worth being precise here, because a lot of channels blur this distinction for dramatic effect. The note is real, and it reflected genuine fear on Diana's part, but official investigators explicitly did not find evidence that her fears were factually justified. Both things are true. She was afraid enough to put it in writing to a lawyer, and the people tasked with investigating her death professionally, years later, found no evidence of the conspiracy she feared. Responsible retellings hold both facts at once instead of choosing the one that makes for a better thumbnail. Now, to William, and to what he has actually said, on the record, about Camilla, because that's a much thinner and more careful record than most YouTube retellings suggest. William has been famously disciplined about never airing private grievances publicly, which is precisely why Harry's memoir Spare, released in January 2023, became such a significant document. It sold more than 1.4 million copies across formats in the UK on its first day alone, a record for a non-fiction release in British publishing history. In it, Harry wrote candidly that both he and William had pleaded with their father not to marry Camilla, and he described his own complicated, often painful feelings about her role in the collapse of their parents' marriage. Harry's portrayal of Camilla was unflattering, framing her as someone who approached her rehabilitation into public life strategically. Royal correspondents, including Katie Nicholl, author of The New Royals, and William and Harry, and Robert Jobson, royal editor of the Evening Standard and author of Charles at 70 and Our King, have both reported for years on tension between William and Camilla that traces back to his teenage years, though neither has published verified quotes of William making the kind of explicit, venomous statements often attributed to him in speculative content online. Jobson's reporting has generally suggested that William's relationship with his stepmother, while never warm in the way tabloids sometimes claim, became functional and civil over time, particularly as Camilla settled into royal life without major scandal. The portrait itself is where fact and internet mythology diverge most sharply, and it's worth clarifying because so much circulating content leans on an invented version of it. There is a well-known 1997 portrait of Diana by the artist Nelson Shanks, commissioned for the Franklin Mint, but never formally hung in a permanent royal residence gallery in the dramatic way some online narratives describe. Diana's actual commemorative presence within royal residences has been handled through a mix of channels. A statue of Diana was unveiled in the Sunken Garden at Kensington Palace on the 1st of July, 2021, what would have been her 60th birthday, commissioned by William and Harry jointly and sculpted by Ian Rank Broadley. That unveiling was a real, public, joint appearance by both brothers at a moment when their relationship was already visibly strained following Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties in 2020, which made their shared appearance notable in itself. Royal correspondent Emily Andrews and others covering the event for outlets, including the Daily Mail, noted the visible effort both brothers made to present unity for their mother's memory, even as their broader relationship had deteriorated. There is no verified documentation of a specific portrait being pulled from decades of storage and secretly rehung in a room called the Hall of Matriarchs, nor of any confrontation of the kind circulating in speculative retellings. If such an event happens in the future, it would be reported by credentialed royal correspondents with named sources, not through anonymous claims with no attribution. What is documented, and arguably more meaningful than any single dramatic scene, is the pattern of how William has chosen to honor his mother publicly throughout his adult life, on his own terms and timeline. He has spoken about her directly and emotionally on several occasions, including in a 2017 documentary titled Diana, Our Mother, Her Life and Legacy, produced for the 20th anniversary of her death, in which William said that not a day goes by where he doesn't think about his mother. In that same documentary, he described the walk behind her coffin as one of the hardest things he has ever done and said he wouldn't wish it on anyone. William has also continued Diana's charitable legacy in tangible ways. He has taken up patronages connected to causes she championed, including HIV and AIDS awareness organizations, at a time when Diana's public gesture of shaking the hand of an HIV-positive patient without gloves in 1987 was considered genuinely radical and helped shift public understanding of the disease. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has also spoken publicly about drawing inspiration from Diana's approach to charitable work, particularly around mental health and early childhood development, causes that echo Diana's instinct for combining royal visibility with grassroots, hands-on engagement rather than purely ceremonial patronage. As for Camilla, her own journey from the most controversial figure in modern royal history to queen consort, and now queen, is itself a matter of extensively documented public record, and arguably a more interesting story than any invented palace confrontation. She and Charles married in a civil ceremony at the Guildhall in Windsor on the 9th of April, 2005, a wedding that was itself unusual, delayed by a day so as not to clash with the funeral of Pope John Paul II, and held as a civil rather than religious ceremony, reportedly at Camilla's own preference given the sensitivities involved. For years afterward, polling consistently showed significant public wariness toward her, and royal commentators, including Penny Junor, author of The Duchess, The Untold Story, have documented how deliberately and slowly Camilla's public rehabilitation was managed by palace communications teams, avoiding the title of Princess of Wales entirely out of respect for how strongly that title remained associated with Diana in public memory. It wasn't until Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee message in February 2022 that the late Queen formally expressed her wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when Charles ascended the throne, a statement widely interpreted as the final, deliberate stamp of institutional approval after nearly 2 decades of careful, incremental public relations work. What all of this reveals, when you strip away the invented confrontations and the unverified dialogue that circulates in so much content about this family, is something quieter and, in its own way, more human than any staged palace drama. It's the story of a family managing grief, resentment, and reconciliation in the way most families do, unevenly, imperfectly, mostly out of public view, and without tidy 5-word lines delivered in empty galleries. William has never publicly forgiven or publicly condemned Camilla in the dramatic terms that speculative content often assigns him. What he has done, consistently and on the record, is choose to honor his mother's memory through his own actions, his own patronages, and his own children, all while maintaining a working, correct relationship with his stepmother that royal watchers have described as civil rather than warm. That distinction matters because it reflects real institutional and personal complexity rather than a scripted rivalry. Diana's death remains, more than a quarter of a century later, one of the defining events of modern British public life, and the way her memory continues to shape the choices of the people who loved her is a genuinely rich, well-documented subject, without needing any invention. The statue in the sunken garden, the AIDS patronages carried forward by her son, the continued public fascination with the Panorama interview, now viewed through a very different lens after Martin Bashir's own conduct in securing it was investigated and criticized in Lord Dyson's 2021 independent inquiry. All of these are real threads worth pulling on. What the record shows is not a single dramatic act of revenge, but a slow, ongoing negotiation between a family's public duty and its private grief, playing out over decades, mostly through small, deliberate, undramatic choices rather than confrontations staged for maximum effect. Diana's presence in her sons' lives, and in the institution she once